It was supposed to be just another night in Miami, until two of the UFC's most notorious fighters crossed paths outside a high-end steakhouse. Moments later, fists were flying, shouts echoed through the parking lot, and police sirens cut through the chaos. The headlines called it an ambush. The charges were serious. But for Jorge Masvidal and Colby Covington, this wasn't some random street fight. It was the boiling point of a friendship gone toxic. They'd once been inseparable. Training partners, roommates, brothers in every way but blood. They celebrated victories together, survived losses together, and then turned into each other's deadliest enemy. What could turn two warriors who shared the same dream into bitter rivals trading blows in public? To answer that, we need to go back to the beginning, before the cameras, before the insults, before the world knew their names. Before the world knew Jorge Masvidal as Gamebred, he was just a scrappy kid from Miami, fighting in backyard brawls for rent money. Colby Covington wasn't famous either, just a wrestling powerhouse fresh out of Oregon State, chasing a dream with more drive than dollars. Their paths collided at American Top Team, one of the most feared gyms in MMA, a place where egos either sharpened or shattered. From day one, they gravitated toward each other. Masvidal had the streetwise grit and stand-up game Colby lacked. Colby had the relentless wrestling pace Masvidal wanted to sharpen. They pushed each other harder than anyone else dared. In those early years, they weren't rivals. They were brothers in arms, built on mutual respect and shared ambition. They weren't just training partners, they were inseparable. Late-night runs after grueling sparring sessions, hours of breaking down fight tape. They celebrated wins with cheap food and laughed about losses over cheaper beer. Masvidal even brought Colby into his Miami world, introducing him to friends and family. For a time, it looked like nothing could break that bond. But in MMA, the closer the bond, the sharper the blade when it breaks. And even in those early days, if you looked closely, you could see little cracks forming, subtle disagreements, tiny moments of ego, the kind that most people ignore until it's too late. Colby was a grinder in the cage, but a ghost outside it. He wasn't moving the UFC needle. Then came the turning point, a fight against Demian Maia in Brazil. Colby dominated, but what happened after the fight changed everything. In the post-fight interview, Covington didn't just thank his team, he lit a verbal firestorm. "Brazil, you're a dump, and all you filthy animals suck." It was nuclear. Fans were outraged. UFC brass were shocked. But instead of apologizing, Colby leaned into it. He crafted the chaos persona, a brash, unfiltered villain who insulted opponents, cities, entire countries. And like it or not, it worked. He went from undercard filler to headline material almost overnight. At first, Masvidal laughed it off. This was Colby's hustle, his way of standing out in a crowded sport. But the persona wasn't just for the cameras. It started bleeding into everyday interactions. Teammates were split. Some loved the attention he brought to ATT, others thought he was burning bridges that didn't need burning. For Masvidal, the change was noticeable. The quiet, driven training partner he'd once lived with was morphing into someone else entirely. Still, he kept his reservations to himself, but silence isn't the same as support, and sooner or later, Colby would take that silence the wrong way. The Brazil comments didn't just anger fans, they brought heat to American Top Team's doorstep. Fighters with Brazilian heritage, some of them Masvidal's close friends, took offense. The gym's once tight-knit atmosphere started to fracture. People began choosing sides, even if no one said it out loud. Masvidal stayed loyal publicly. He didn't throw his friend under the bus. But privately, he questioned whether the Chaos Act was worth the damage it was causing. Colby, meanwhile, doubled down. He targeted more fighters in interviews, even those in the same gym. Every outrageous comment built his brand, but eroded the trust of the people around him. The real turning point came when whispers started that Colby's trash talk wasn't just hype, that it was personal, that he was willing to cross lines that teammates considered sacred. Masvidal, who valued loyalty above all else, began to see a version of Colby he didn't recognize. They were still friends at this point, still training, still smiling in photos, but the tension was undeniable. The bond that once seemed unbreakable was being tested, and the cracks were about to split wide open. At a glance, their friendship seemed unshakable. Masvidal, the veteran striker with street brawl roots, and Covington, the collegiate wrestling machine had found a rhythm few fighters could replicate. But it wasn't just the gym where they built this chemistry, it was home. The apartment they shared wasn't much. 2 bedrooms, a beat-up couch, a kitchen stocked with discount protein powder and bulk pasta. Fight posters covered the walls, most of them from events they'd cornered each other in. They didn't have much, but what they did have was built around one thing: the grind. Their days were brutal. Up before dawn for road work, then back home for eggs and oatmeal before the first sparring session. In between training blocks, they'd watch fight tape together, pausing to argue about setups or debate which fighters had the best cardio in the game. Masvidal would share little tricks he'd picked up in street fights, how to mask a feint with a head tilt or hide a body shot behind a jab. Colby would drag Jorge into endless wrestling drills, grinding takedowns until both were drenched in sweat. It was a life fueled by ambition and mutual trust. Jorge often spoke about how Colby was like a brother. Colby told interviewers that Jorge had his back no matter what. But living together also meant seeing the sides of each other that didn't make the highlight reels. Masvidal could be stubborn and set in his routines. Colby, obsessive and sometimes abrasive. Little disagreements cropped up about who left dishes in the sink, who slacked on cleaning, who skipped their share of rent when a fight purse was delayed. At first, they laughed it off, but money is a dangerous fault line in combat sports. The UFC pays on a per-fight basis, and if an injury or matchup fell through, bills didn't wait. More than once, Jorge had to float extra cash to keep the apartment running. More than once, Colby reminded him of it later, twisting the gesture into a subtle power play. It wasn't enough to break them, not yet, but the foundation of their friendship was changing. Respect and loyalty were still there, but small cracks were forming beneath the surface. And in the fight game, those cracks don't stay hidden for long. 2019 was the year the world really started paying attention. Masvidal's flying knee against Ben Askren wasn't just a knockout, it was an explosion, the fastest finish in UFC history. Overnight, Jorge went from journeyman veteran to one of the biggest names in the sport. He was suddenly headlining cards, doing late-night TV spots, and fielding offers outside the octagon. Colby was on a similar trajectory. His decision win over Robbie Lawler was a clinic, and it set him up for a shot at Kamaru Usman's welterweight belt. The chaos persona, hated by some, loved by others, was bringing in headlines, and the UFC was cashing in on the attention. For the first time, they were both within striking distance of the same prize. 2 fighters, same division, same gym. The media pounced on it. Every interview included the question, "Would you fight your friend for the title?" Masvidal handled it cautiously. "If it makes sense and the money's right, we'll talk," he said. It was the kind of answer that left room for loyalty. Colby? He didn't hesitate. "I'll fight anyone, anytime, anywhere. Doesn't matter who it is." That difference in tone wasn't lost on Jorge. In his mind, fighting a teammate, especially one he considered family, should be the last option, not the first. Colby saw it differently. In his world, the belt was everything, and friendship didn't change that. The UFC, smelling the potential payday, quietly fanned the flames. Promotional graphics placed them side by side. Commentators hinted at the matchup. Fans began arguing online about who would win if the 2 brothers met in the cage. The tension wasn't just about competition, it was about principle. Masvidal's code of loyalty clashed with Colby's all-business mindset. And once that friction started, there was no going back. By early 2020, the split was becoming public. The turning point came after Colby's win over Rafael dos Anjos. According to Masvidal, Colby refused to pay a longtime ATT coach his agreed share of the fight purse. In a gym built on loyalty and mutual respect, that was a cardinal sin. Jorge took it personally. This wasn't about a few $1,000s. It was about honoring the people who helped you win. And if Colby could disrespect a coach they both trusted, what did that say about his loyalty to anyone? Masvidal began making his feelings known in interviews, calling Colby a fake and questioning his character. Colby, never one to hold back, went nuclear. He mocked Jorge's personal life, his finances, even his divorce. These weren't just fight promo insults, these were deeply personal jabs meant to wound. The atmosphere at American Top Team turned toxic. Teammates were forced to pick sides. Some stayed loyal to Masvidal, valuing his years with the gym. Others backed Colby, believing his star power benefited everyone. Coaches had to schedule separate training times to keep them from crossing paths. Gym founder Dan Lambert, who had supported both fighters, eventually drew a hard line. No trash talk about teammates, period. But the rule came too late. The damage was already done. By the time 2020 rolled into 2021, the friendship wasn't just fractured, it was gone. In its place was a rivalry as personal as any in UFC history. And when the UFC finally gave the green light for Masvidal versus Covington, the fight was more than just a payday. It was a chance for revenge. March 5, 2022, UFC 272. For years, fans had speculated about this matchup. Now it was finally official. Jorge Masvidal versus Colby Covington. But this wasn't just a fight. It was the culmination of years of friendship, betrayal, and public humiliation. The build-up was vicious. Press conferences turned into verbal shootouts. Colby taunted Masvidal relentlessly, calling him Street Judas, and claiming he had carried Jorge through sparring sessions during their ATT days. Masvidal fired back, promising to break Colby's face and expose him as a fraud. At Media Day, the tension was palpable. Neither man cracked a smile. Every stare-down felt like it could boil over into chaos. The UFC leaned into it, plastering former friends, now bitter rivals, across every promotional graphic. Fight night was electric. The crowd roared as Masvidal walked out to his signature track, his eyes locked on the cage. Covington followed, soaking in the boos, feeding off them like fuel. From the opening bell, it was clear this was going to be a battle of styles. Masvidal hunting for the knockout, Covington using relentless pressure and wrestling. Jorge had moments, landing sharp shots in the clinch and threatening with counters. But Colby's pace was suffocating. Takedown after takedown, control against the fence, smothering pressure. By the championship rounds, Masvidal was visibly fatigued. Colby, still talking trash mid-fight, seemed to draw energy from dominating the man he once called a brother. The final horn sounded, and the judges were unanimous. Covington by decision. For most rivalries, that would have been the end. The score settled in the cage. But for these two, the bad blood didn't just survive the fight, it deepened. And soon, it would spill out of the octagon entirely. 2 weeks after UFC 272, the feud reignited, this time in the streets of Miami. Covington was dining at a high-end steakhouse with friends. The night seemed uneventful until, according to police reports, Masvidal appeared outside. Witnesses claim Jorge, wearing a surgical mask and hoodie, approached from behind and threw punches, allegedly breaking one of Colby's teeth. Security footage captured the aftermath. Covington pacing on the sidewalk, clearly shaken, talking to police officers. Masvidal's side of the story. He claimed it was street justice for things Colby had said about his family in the lead-up to UFC 272. "You don't talk about someone's kids," Jorge told reporters later. "There are lines you don't cross." Colby pressed charges, calling Masvidal a coward for attacking him outside the cage. The incident made national headlines, sparking debates across the fight world. Was it a justified personal response or a criminal act that crossed the line? The legal consequences were real. Masvidal was arrested and faced charges of aggravated battery and criminal mischief. Fans, fighters, and pundits split into camps. Some saw Jorge as defending his honor, others viewed it as a stain on his career. But whatever your stance, one thing was clear: the fight had left the octagon, and there was no going back. The aftermath of the steakhouse incident cast a long shadow over both fighters' careers. For Masvidal, legal battles and media scrutiny became a constant distraction. Sponsors grew cautious, the UFC kept its distance, and the possibility of a rematch with Covington faded into uncertainty. Colby, for his part, leaned into the role of the villain. He wore the incident like a badge of honor, claiming it proved Masvidal couldn't beat him in the cage and had to resort to cheap shots in public. He doubled down on his trash talk, cementing his heel persona even further. Within the MMA community, opinions remained polarized. Some fighters respected Masvidal's stance on family loyalty, others condemned the move as unprofessional and damaging to the sport's image. Fans argued endlessly on social media, keeping the rivalry alive long after the court dates were set. Years from now, people might forget the scorecards from UFC 272. They might not remember the exact rounds, the takedowns, or the strikes, but they'll remember the story. Two men who started as brothers, pushed each other to the top, and ended up as sworn enemies in one of the most personal feuds in fight sports history. And if fate ever puts them in the same room again, whether it's a gym, a press conference, or another Miami restaurant, there's no guarantee the cameras will catch it before history repeats itself. Every great rivalry in combat sports has a moment where the dust finally settles, where the fighters, win or lose, shake hands and move on. But Jorge Masvidal and Colby Covington never had that moment. For them, UFC 272 didn't close the book. It just tore out a chapter and set it on fire. The steakhouse incident didn't bring resolution. It poured gasoline on an already raging feud. And every time one of their names comes up in interviews, you can feel the embers still glowing. In many ways, their story isn't just about two men. It's about the fight world itself. MMA is a sport built on discipline and respect. But it's also an industry driven by egos, headlines, and money. Friendships are forged in sweat and blood, but those same bonds can be broken just as easily by pride, opportunity, and a few careless words. Masvidal still walks to the cage with the swagger that made him a fan favorite, carrying the weight of his code. That loyalty matters more than belts. Covington still plays the role of the chaos agent, smiling through the booze, convinced that winning is the only real truth in the fight game. Maybe time will dull the edges of their rivalry. Maybe one day they'll trade gloves for handshakes. Or maybe, like so many legendary grudges, this one will remain frozen in place. A cautionary tale of what happens when ambition collides with friendship at the very top of the fight world. And as fans, we can't help but wonder, if the right payday came along, if the stars lined up just right, would we see it again? Masvidal versus Covington 2. No masks, no surprise attack. Just two former brothers settling unfinished business under the bright lights, with the whole world watching. Because if there's one thing fight fans know, it's this: the greatest rivalries don't really end. They just wait for the next round.